Since the dawn of civilization, spies of every nation and culture have worked to infiltrate their adversaries and glean the information that will give their side the advantage. The stakes are sky high, the strategies varied and imaginative, and the ultimate sign of success is that no one ever even knew you were there. In each episode, we will explore the moral and ethical gray zones of espionage, where treachery and betrayal go hand in hand with cunning and courage. This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 122 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. Joining me today is Tomasz Awlasewicz. Tom is an author, journalist, and expert on counterintelligence who has taught courses at the SWPS University of Social Sciences in Warsaw and elsewhere. Currently, he focuses on the Cold War-era intelligence and counterintelligence units of the Polish People's Republic. I invited Tom onto the podcast to discuss his new book, Invisible, The Greatest Secret of the Secret Services of the Polish People's Republic. It's about a covert unit of Polish counterintelligence officers who specialized in penetrating foreign embassies to steal their secrets. The unit was filled with safecrackers and second-story men, and they paid an incredible price for their years of service to their government. It was a high-risk, high-reward mission, and Tom was able to uncover the entire story for us. But before we dive into this story, I want to ask you something. Are you an amateur military historian like me? Has this podcast rekindled your interest in Eastern Europe and the Cold War? Maybe you're finally getting into reenacting and living history, just like you've always said you would. If so, you should check out the incredible collection of surplus military goods at Krasicki.com. Krus himself scours the continent for the best uniforms and field equipment available and delivers them right to your door. He's got almost anything you can imagine and many things you haven't. Uniforms from East Germany, the Soviet Union, modern-day Bulgaria, Poland, and Russia are all available. Rucksacks, mess kits, and load-bearing gear are also up on the site right now. The inventory is constantly changing, so you never know what kind of gems you might stumble on, all at very affordable prices. Find it all at Krasicki.com. That's KRUSCHIKI.com. And use the discount code SPYCRAFT101 for 10% off your order. Tom, thank you for joining me today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I've been looking forward to this, honestly, ever since we were first in contact. I know it hasn't been that long, but this is a very exciting story to me. You know, I've read a little bit here and there about these types of operations before, but I never expected to be essentially handed such a complete and detailed account of these stories as the one that you've put together. So I'm very excited about it, honestly.
Yeah, it's one of the most exciting parts of espionage. So
no doubt about it.
I can
think
tell the
people are
story.
gonna feel that way. So right. What is it that led you to research this specific story in the first place?
Well, I've been working on the history of counterintelligence and telling about the importance of counterintelligence through history for a number of years now. As I was working on my first book, which was around 2016-17, and I was interviewing many officers of our Polish counterintelligence, some of them mentioned during the interviews that they have seen actual photocopies of documents of foreign intelligence agencies. I kind of connected that with something I had heard a few years before that, probably around 10 years ago now. It was an interview with our former Minister of Internal Affairs, former boss of the entire intelligence of Poland. He mentioned that there had been a group during the times of the Polish People's Republic, which was before 1990. There was a group of men from the counterintelligence that entered practically any embassy, any consulate that they wanted to visit, and they opened safes, they copied the document and disappeared, and they had never been caught. The interesting information in that, another interesting information, because what he already said was fascinating anyway, but he also said that the method that they used included x-raying things, and that most of these people simply died, so they wouldn't be able to tell the story. And, you know, it was the former Minister of Internal Affairs, so, you know, serious person, but still, the story was so amazing that people just, you know, nobody ever picked it up. The media didn't pick it up. Nobody cared about what he said. And then when I was interviewing the men that I mentioned before, the different counterintelligence officers, I connected these two things, right? So them saying that they had actually seen photocopies of documents, and this man, the former Minister of Internal Affairs, saying that they did what he said they did. And so I started, dwelling on the subject, and that's how I got to the truth.
Amazing stuff, really. And speaking of the truth, how is it that you were able to uncover so much of this? Because it seems like a lot of these stories that I try to cover steeped in mystery, but you have got practically all, if not absolutely all of the story, don't you?
I do. 1989, 1990, everything changes in this part of Europe, obviously. Post 1990, a lot of people started saying that we should declassify whatever documents we had concerning, the intelligence, counterintelligence, the secret police in Poland. They had different reasons and arguments. Some said that, it was because they had to uncover who was an agent. Some said that it was because nobody would be able to blackmail others once you declassify the documents. Everybody would know who was an agent, so you wouldn't be able to be blackmailed, for example, politicians, things like that. So they had different reasons, there were different arguments, and finally Poland did declassify documents. First some of them, later on all of them, and I'm talking practically all. I mean 99.999%. The only things that are left apparently are things concerning, maybe secret bunker somewhere that still exists and could be used and things like that. Everything else was declassified. And, honestly, it was a mistake. I mean, it's quite embarrassing that we actually let people know who was our agent, not so long ago, frankly, right? I mean, the Cold War is not something that happened 100 years ago. Quite embarrassing, to be honest. Obviously, I have something to work on, so you could say, yeah, great. But on the other hand, like I said, it is quite embarrassing. And now, with the documents declassified, I hope I can use these documents to raise counterintelligence awareness. So this big mistake of declassifying could be used to do something good. That's what I'm doing.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I can certainly appreciate your candor on that. When you say that it's embarrassing, is it because it revealed the names of people who, still lived among the populace and that sort of thing? Or did it reveal the heavy-handed role that they took at the time, or all of the above?
No, I'm talking about, revealing the names of our agents, our sources. I mean, this is unacceptable, in a serious intelligence service. And all the officers that worked at that time and post 1990 are embarrassed by it, because it was not them that chose to do that. It was the politicians
Mhm.
and so on who had no idea of how it works. And, hopefully we are able to rebuild the trust among, foreigners, the trust for our intelligence services. For many years, obviously, somebody that was being recruited by our, intelligence, counterintelligence, whatever, could say, come on, I'm not going to work with you guys. Look what you did to the documents. But, it's been a
Right.
while since that happened. And I think we're building a reputation for ourselves. I hope it gets better now.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding is that among her allies, Poland's intelligence services have an excellent reputation now, don't they?
They do. They do. I mean, we've been close allies since 1990, and we've worked together since practically day one. I mean, 1989, we were, you could say enemies, and 1990, we worked together. The CIA,
Hmm.
the FBI worked with the Polish intelligence service and with the men I'm describing in my book and we'll be talking about in our podcast.
Fantastic. Yeah, I did cover a related subject anyway on an episode quite some time ago called about a book called "From Warsaw with Love" with a Washington Post journalist named John Pomfret at the time, and that was a great look at it. And it really was amazing how quickly that relationship changed for the better for both countries. In from 1990 until Desert Storm. I mean, that book opens with Polish intelligence operatives rescuing American personnel in Iraq and Kuwait during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. And
Right.
just like you said, just a couple of years earlier than that, they'd been on opposite sides of the Iron Curtain, so to speak.
Right. It was very quick and it has been great since then.
Yes, I'm glad to hear it. So this unit that you're talking about in particular, I think that you said they're called, was it Section 3 or Department 3, something
Section
like that?
9, Section
Section
9.
9. Okay.
It was Department 2, Section 9. So inside the Ministry of Internal Affairs during that time, before 1990, there was Department 1, first department, which was the intelligence, and then there was the second department, which was counterintelligence. And within counterintelligence, you had Section 9, and these are the men that conducted these clandestine searches that we will be talking about.
Okay, fantastic. So was this, well, I should say, was the intelligence service as a whole, was this a lot of operations like directed or funded by Soviet Union at that time, or was this all like organic Polish government directed operations?
Of course, if you ask an average person, they will say that everything that happened before 1990 was, funded by the Russians and so on. But the truth is very different, actually. I mean, post 1945, 1944, 1945, the Second World War ends. And yeah, you have Russian officers basically running our intelligence service, kind of, right? They are actually present here. They have their offices. But, after that, and especially, after 1953, 54, 55, 56, that changes a lot. We're becoming more and more and more independent. And once we get to the 70s and 80s that we'll be talking about, of course, we're still allies, right? We have the Warsaw Pact. So obviously we share information, but the officers are not present here. They don't just freely walk into any office and, check the documents. They don't give orders. They are informed about things, just like today you could say the Poles are informed about stuff that we do if it's important, right? Obviously we don't share everything because, even within NATO, not all intelligence services, share everything. That's how intelligence services work. But we still share important stuff. You also share important stuff with us, right? If it concerns us, if it's dangerous for us, it's whatever. You drop us a message, let's say. So that's the way it was in the 70s, 80s too, right? We shared information, but no, it was not funded. But there is an important thing that we have to mention, is that the most important method that was used for opening locks, combination locks mainly, mechanical combination locks, the one with the dial and everything. So the method that was used to open these was introduced to us by the Russians. That's an undeniable fact. But once we were shown this method, which happened probably in the early 70s, but it for sure happened before the oldest of my interviewees joined the Section 9. We don't know for sure, and it's also not in the documents, but it seems that it was early 70s. Yeah, we were shown that, and then from then we developed that method and we became basically completely independent. If there was a huge problem, if we had something we couldn't do, just like, in other parts of the world, different intelligence services help each other, but that happened rarely. And basically in the 80s, we did everything to actually avoid meeting with the Russians. And when you look at who the documents that they obtained, that Section 9 obtained, were, who the documents were shared with, you can clearly see that not everything, and not even a big part, goes to the Soviet Union, right? It's just some general things that go, to the Soviet Union, to Hungary, other allied forces. Yeah, just normal sharing, but definitely not, we're not being funded, and these were not Soviet operations.
Okay, I see. So, of course, the object here is to penetrate foreign embassies, like you mentioned. Do you know what the specific criteria were for who and when and how they would penetrate? Like, I assume that embassies from NATO allied countries would be priority number one, but there was probably a lot more that went into it than that, I would imagine.
Definitely NATO mainly. But we have to understand one thing. I don't know if probably a lot of our listeners will know that, but for those who don't know, let's make one thing clear. It doesn't work the way you see it in movies, right? So it's not one officer that has an idea to conduct some operation, then he opens the logs, then he takes photographs, and then he's also a case officer for the agent. It's a big structure. So a lot of intelligence services, counterintelligence services, they have what I guess you call support staff. So let's say you have case officers that work within counterintelligence, and they recruit agents. They have the whole picture, right? They have the documentation. They look at the whole, spectrum, let's say. And then they have the support staff, which is, surveillance units, foot, car surveillance. You have the technical people that, can bug a place, right? And then you have people like the ones we're talking about. And these men are not case officers. They don't recruit agents. They are given requests by the case officers. So by, for example, the British section within the counterintelligence, then the British, the Americans, obviously, right? The Germans, I mean, the West Germans, of course, were targets for us. So you had the case officers that dealt with that. And then they had different ideas, right? For how to find out more about these particular countries. So they would contact this Section 9 that we're talking about. And they would say, well, we would really like to see what's inside the German embassy. We would like to see what is inside the Italian embassy, the Swedish embassy, whatever. And could you help us, right? So they were given such requests. And then Section 9 also cooperating with other units, because Section 9 also got information. Well, actually, sorry, scratch that. Section 9 didn't cooperate with other units, but the case officers that I mentioned, they cooperated at the same time with surveillance units, with the technical people, the bugs and everything. And so they gave Section 9 this, whole picture, and they said, look, we have surveillance saying that, I don't know, let's say Italian guards walk around the embassy only at 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning and 6 in the morning. Can you check whether it would be in any way possible to enter the embassy somewhere between these hours and avoid seeing them, and open the safes and leave before they notice you? And then Section 9 did all of the research and told the case officers whether it was possible or not. And honestly, 99% of the time the answer was yes, which doesn't mean that you could enter any embassy you wanted, because obviously the case officers wouldn't even ask to have the Section 9 enter an embassy that was, for example, full of people 24/7. And there were such embassies. Like, for example, the American embassy in Warsaw, which was is still, right, it's the same building, is a huge building. You have people there present all the time. At night, you would have people actually working on stuff inside the vault. So it was impossible, and nobody would even ask them to check whether it was possible to enter that particular place. But different places that theoretically were possible to enter, like, for example, the embassy that I mentioned, the Italian one, they had armed guards 24/7, but there were no people working inside at night. So if you avoided meeting, let's say, clashing with the guards, you could theoretically get in, and that was done.
Okay, I see. That's amazing to me that the internals of the building would often be unoccupied, but if you see an opportunity there, of course you're going to take it. I mean, you'd be crazy not to.
Well,
So
actually,
was
you'd be
when
surprised, because most embassies, and that probably doesn't only concern Poland, but also other countries. I don't know today, but at that time, most embassies and most consulates were actually unoccupied at night. You could have guards, you could have people sleeping in them, literally, having rooms and sleeping as a form of protection. But they wouldn't be working, and they wouldn't be inside the offices. They wouldn't be inside the vault. They just locked the door. They locked the best locks. They found the best locks they could find, locked everything, had vaults, had alarm systems. And they thought, come on, we have all of this stuff. We have all of this, these locks and alarm systems. And then we also have people sleeping there. So who would come and open all of this without us, waking up? It's just impossible. But it was possible.
Incredible. So you mentioned that the case officers would come to Section 9. So were these operations typically to look for some like specific information thought to be in a specific office, or was it more about an unguarded or a poorly guarded facility and trying to get in and just get anything that you could?
These were not poorly guarded facilities. Seriously. I mean, the ones that they entered, you could say, oh, they entered it, so it was poorly guarded, but they were actually pretty well guarded very often. But it was just, one of the officers told me, and, this is true for a lot of aspects of life. He said everything is possible, but the big question is it worth it, and how much money you'll have to invest in it? So, you can have the best embassy. You could have the Russian embassy in Washington, right? And you could say, come on, this is impossible. But if you invest $50 billion and work on it for 10 years, who knows? Maybe you'll be able to enter it every night. You'll find a way, right? Yeah, they were not fully guarded. These were long-term operations. So it rarely happened that the case officer would say, oh, hey, okay, we have a specific date and we have a specific document that we know is going to come through the embassy. So you go there and you get it. Such things usually happen with, let's say, unpopular or uninteresting countries. So you could have, I don't know, let me think what they entered. Argentina, right? Argentinian embassy, right? So you can have something interesting, but it was not worth the risk to actually go there, for example, 2 times a week and copy everything. So you'd only enter once a year, twice a year, because the case officer said, oh yeah, we think there's going to be something interesting. So you also had to take a year or 2 years, or sometimes 10 years to actually get in, because, if you look at the documents, like, let's say, the Embassy of India, right? There is a file which I saw which concerns the Embassy of India. The first details, right? So sketches of rooms, and an officer describing in the 1960s that, I don't know, there's a hole in the roof and there is a whatever, something that you could go through and the gate opens this way, not that way, whatever. So this starts, for example, in the 60s, and then they enter many, many years later based on all of this that was obtained over the years. So it takes sometimes a long time. So yeah, there were cases where, they would enter because there was a request for a particular document, but this usually happened with the unpopular embassies and or consulates. But the ones that were interesting for sure all the time, right? They were simply visited on a regular basis. So some of them twice a week.
What?
Yeah, twice a week.
Wow.
So I'm sorry to say that, the most important targets of our counterintelligence were the American consulates in
Mhm.
Krakow. Obviously, I'm sorry because, we're probably going to have American listeners mainly, but, we became friends in 1990. The same officers became friends with the CIA, FBI officers, so no hard feelings. It was the Cold War, right? So our main targets were, the consulates of the US in Krakow, which is a big city in Poland, and Poznań, which is another big city in Poland. And these places were visited 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 times a year. So
My
you can
gosh.
imagine. And, during some periods, twice a week. Important to mention that both of these consulates, and especially the Poznan one, were occupied at night by the workers who lived inside. So in Krakow, there were also people who were, who had the rooms there, but it was a little bit easier because it was like a different side of the building, right? So you were a little bit farther from, the people who could hear the noise, the Americans. And then in Poznan, these people were right next door. Sometimes you would be just walking by the door where somebody 10 inches away was in his bed. So it's pretty amazing.
That's shocking to me, honestly. That's incredible. So they were getting, when you say visiting 40, 50 times a year or more, you're talking about accessing the locked offices inside, not just, scaling a fence or something like that?
Well, the offices are obviously interesting too, but this was not the main target. The main target was there are many names for that. We use the word bunker, but basically is the vault, which all of the American and embassies of many other countries had. So a safe room. There was basically a vault. The Americans, you made, quite frankly, great vaults. You had this consulate, which was not a huge. It wasn't like the embassy in Warsaw. The embassy in Warsaw, like I said, is a huge structure with tennis courts and a hotel and things like that, right? So the consulate was a fairly small place. I can't remember how many people worked there, but I'm guessing like 14, 15 maybe, right? People
Okay.
worked in such a place. Still, even though it was not, a major embassy, you had great vaults. It was a room that was, okay, your specialist came basically, probably CIA people, maybe FBI, who knows. They came when the building where the consulate was given to you. I can't remember if it was sold to you or rented, doesn't matter. You were given a building by the Polish government, and your specialist came, and it's also described in some of the documents, this whole process where, the Polish counterintelligence actually, watches the experts come, and they know when they are here, and they, look through their bags at the hotel. And obviously your CIA experts were great experts, so they didn't have anything in their bags, but you still had to check, right? One of the men that I interviewed said that, whenever they went inside a hotel room and they looked inside the bag and there was only underwear, it was pretty clear that it was a security expert from the CIA or the FBI,
Mhm.
because other people would have some documents, passports, whatever, but the security guys, they were too cautious to leave anything behind, so they only had underwear, etc., in their room. So you were given that building, and then the experts came from your intelligence and counterintelligence, and they looked at the layout, and they found the room that was somewhere in the back, right? Room without windows and things like that. And then they basically built another room inside this room. So they put thick walls inside this room, creating another room. And then at the entrance, they put vault doors. Mosler, it's a famous, I think it doesn't exist anymore, but it was a famous American safe slash vault door brand. Mosler. Yeah, I'm not sure if you've
Mhm.
heard of it, but yeah, it's pretty old. And I saw some of these safes being sold for a lot of money now to collectors. Yeah. So they would put, vault doors at the entrance, and they would also put what do you call it? Like a counter on the top of the door, or actually above the door. So every time you open the door, the counter would show how many times the door was open. And the
Oh, okay.
counter was actually inside a, well, I don't know what you call it in English, I'm sorry, in a liquid, right? That was, of course, solid, became solid after it, it dried up. Yeah. So this liquid, as it was drying and the counter was inside, it had paint and threads pushed into the liquid. So once it became solid, you had these irregular structures, and you can see a picture in my book actually with with this paint, like shades and these threads, irregular shapes, right? So it was done because the Americans wanted to make sure that nobody would replace the counter, because the counter you could buy actually at a specialist store somewhere in West Germany, right? It wasn't rocket science. But because they didn't want somebody to replace the counter, obviously, they put it inside this liquid, which became solid and had these irregular shapes, and it was extremely difficult to recreate. It took a long time for our counterintelligence to figure out how to do it, but I'm sorry, I'm not sure what it's called in English, because that's actually difficult vocabulary in Polish for me. I only know it because I talked to these men. But they used a vacuum pump, I don't know what it's called, a water vacuum pump or something like that, to actually recreate all these shapes inside this liquid and create 2 copies of these counters that they simply replaced. Every time they visited the vault, they would just unscrew the original one, put the replacement one, leave with the original. Then when they came back, they usually put back the original one, because they did whatever they could for the original one to be hanging as much as possible. And they had 2 copies, but they wouldn't replace the copy with a copy. They usually tended to, return the original one when they visited again. And yeah, so your vaults were great, but yeah, we were able to get in.
Incredible. That's incredible stuff. My gosh, Tom. So clearly a huge amount of prep work had to go into all of these operations, even if you were able to regularly pull them off. So can you explain how all of these locations were scouted and assessed and that sort of thing before the first person actually entered the first time?
Right. Well, let's go back to the case officers, right? From different sections, the British, the American one, the German one, the French one. So they, of course, had to gather as much information as they could for Section 9, which, didn't have time or resources or, didn't even feel like doing such things. So, the case officers had to come with as much as they could. So obviously, like in any country, I mean, this is the same in any country around the world, there were agents who were recruited from within the embassy. As you can imagine, 99% of the agents usually are the citizens of the home country, right? So in all of these embassies, you had Polish cleaning lady or a Polish janitor or a Polish secretary or something like that. So first, these people were recruited just like in any other country. Even the countries that don't do this clandestine searches, and many of them surely do until this day. Now it's a little bit more difficult because of the electronics. There's much more electronics now than there was in the past, but I'm sure it's done. So even the countries that don't do it, they still obviously recruit people, to gather information. And a secretary inside an embassy like this, even if she didn't know anything about counterintelligence, she still was not surprised that, somebody from the Polish counterintelligence wanted to talk to her and find out when the ambassador comes, or if she had heard something interesting and, whatever. These people were recruited just like they are in any other country, even if these clandestine searches are not done, right? So they gave you, tidbits of, different information. So they would tell you when the guards come, which guard has an alcohol problem and falls asleep at night. And the crucial thing is that they were never asked questions that would indicate that we actually enter the crucial, rooms inside the embassy. Preferably, they were not even asked questions that would show that we go far. They knew, just like any other citizen in the world knows, that the counterintelligence would try to install a wiretap, right? They would bug the place, they would do something, right? Take pictures, maybe install a camera, right? But you couldn't ask anything more. And even if you, for example, if a secretary told you that, I mean, you meaning, a case officer, if a case officer was told that the cipher room guy, let's say, right, the guy that's in charge in the cipher room, the vault, he has a drug problem, right? So even then, the Polish counterintelligence wouldn't think, okay, maybe we'll recruit that guy, we'll blackmail him, we'll recruit him, whatever. No, that was not done, simply because we had a safer, it's a funny thing, but we had a safer method where nobody would ever find out. I mean, if you recruit a guy with drug problems and he's going to let you in, he might not say anything for a year, but then after that, who knows, right? He'll be sent back home and he'll, tell the FBI, and then, there's going to be a trap set up for us or something like this. So nobody was ever told, none of these, sources that were recruited were ever told anything that would in any way indicate that we were going anywhere far. They would think, if anything, that, it's just normal bugs or whatever. And maybe, we need to install some cables outside on the wall. And that's why we're asking when the guards are, present or not. So, even knowing what you know already about my book and the story, it's hard for you to believe that somebody would go inside the vault. So imagine how hard it would be for a source, a secretary or whatever, janitor, to actually even have the idea that anybody goes inside the vault at night. So, they were not told, they were not asked about such things, they had no idea, but still they gave you some information, right? That you could put
Hmm.
together. And, after 10 years, you had a good set of, information that would allow you to go inside. Then you also had the surveillance, of course, like I said. So, like in most countries, you had some kind of surveillance units, stationed next to the embassy in a building across the street. So they would, write down, of course, when the lights go on, when the lights go off, when the cleaning lady comes, when the guards go around the building, and so on. Then you also had wiretaps, although surprisingly not many, because we're able to go inside these places so often. And so you could say easily, of course, it took time, but still we were able to do it, that, it didn't make sense for us to install wiretaps in, let's say, the ambassador's room, because obviously this place was checked for bugs. And once it was checked, they would know we were there, right?
Hmm.
So, so it didn't make sense to install a wiretap, which would give us some information, but we would risk exposing the fact that we were inside, right? So
Right.
even if it was
Right.
maybe in the reception or something, I've heard of wiretaps, but very rarely, right? Obviously the phones were bugged, but that's quite obvious, right? But that's also a source of information. Phones.
Hmm.
So all of this put together, mail surveillance also, right? So the mail would be intercepted and checked. All of this was research was done on that, information was gathered, and then the officers would go to section 9, and section 9 would be told, yeah, we have this and that, the guards are asleep between these and these hours, what can you do? And then obviously our officers would also analyze all of this. The section 9 officers would analyze all of this and possibly come back with questions. So for example, let's say that they would like a picture of a lock, right? Yeah. So, then the case officers would see what they can do. And, sometimes if we're talking, for example, about the first lock, and the first lock, even the simplest lock on the gate or the entrance door is also crucial, because obviously, I guess we'll be talking about that later. What it actually looked like step by step. But obviously you can't stand on the street and struggle with the lock, the first one, because people can see you, right? People
Of
from
course.
the embassy, potentially, if they look outside the window, people from across the street can see you, the guards can see you. So, for example, if they needed a picture of the first log, they would say, can you get a picture? And this was easy. A case officer could actually go inside and pretend like he was somebody that needed something from the embassy, just take a picture and come back, right? So such things were done, and all of this was collected, and then they would start gradually going inside. So, it takes time. First, you go through the first door, you see what the next lock is, you see if you can open it or not, and so on and so on and so on. It's a long process.
Hmm. My gosh. Yeah, I can imagine. That's amazing. So during the actual operation, the overnight operation, how many people would be involved? Or was it just like one person going in by himself, or were there, a network of people out on the street watching in all directions, that sort of thing?
They're directly at the embassy or the consulate, whatever. Because also, I forgot to mention that embassies and consulates were the main targets, but there were also other places. For example, different countries, for example, have institutions that operate as a cover for the intelligence. So, for example, if our counterintelligence found out that the Institute of, let's say, I'm making this up now, but I don't know, the Institute of Spanish Language, which is run by the embassy, the Spanish embassy, is actually some kind of cover for the intelligence, they would also go inside, right? So these were different places. So inside the building, right, we in Poland call it objects, right? So inside the object, inside the building, you'd have usually at least 3 people, right? But this was the minimum, and 3 people would go inside usually only when all of the locks had already been seen, and for example, we were able to make a copy, and then we knew, for example, the combination, because it was determined a week or 2 weeks ago, it's still not changed. So it was an easy job, so you could go inside, walk out easily. So minimum of 3 inside, but you could have more, obviously not crowds, right? So there's been times when my interviewees told me that there was a bigger bunch of people, but of course bigger bunches, 6, 7, 8, but this is rare. So usually a few, 4 or 5, yeah, that would be enough. They had equipment they had to carry, so it would be difficult to go just single-handedly, and obviously also not safe. But these are the people that are inside. But you also asked, it's a very good question, what about surveillance and the outside and everything? So this took, these operations included dozens and dozens and dozens of people. So the case officers, because each time Section 9 entered the embassy, the case officer from the section that dealt with a particular country was present, right? This person had to be inside because Section 9 officers actually had no idea what they were supposed to copy. They had no idea because they did not care. They had other problems to worry about. So they were opening locks, they were carrying the equipment, they were, doing all these things. But once the safe was open, they pulled out the documents for the case officers because they were professionals. They knew how to move them and be able to, put them in the right place later. Also, actually, pictures were taken, with instant cameras before anything was touched, so you could recreate it later. But that's a longer story. But still, they were pulling out documents for the officer. But it was the officer, the case officer, that actually said, "Yeah, we need that. Yeah, anyway, we don't need this." The case officer knew the language. These Section 9 officers went into so many embassies, and there was just about a dozen of them that did that. So not many. They didn't know all the languages. They didn't know Japanese. They didn't know Spanish. They didn't know Italian, right? So it was the case officer that had to say, yeah, this is not important. We're not copying this. This is important. We're copying this. So he was always present. And he was kind of the person that had to organize everything around the embassy too for Section 9. So he was the one that dealt with the surveillance. He had to order surveillance for that particular day. And if we're talking about surveillance, we're talking about a few dozen people, 60 people, 70 people, 2, 3, 4 sections of our surveillance arm were all told that they had to work that particular night. None of them knew exactly why. Some of them that were closest to the embassy would know that, that's something about the embassy. They also didn't know that anybody went inside the vault. They probably didn't have this idea even, right? And they probably thought, yeah, again, that it's wiretaps or whatever, right? They knew there was the embassy, but the other officers could possibly not even know that there was something happening inside the embassy, but they were told that they have to go and follow British diplomat John Smith from the embassy to his apartment, watch whether he's in his bed, if the lights don't come on, if he doesn't get in his car, until they're told that they're free. So 4 or 5 in the morning, they would be told, okay, you can go home, because, the Section 9 would be out of the embassy, right? So we're talking about, dozens and dozens of people, because even look at, let's say, the Krakow consulate, the American consulate that I mentioned. You could have 15 workers, but each worker needed to have at least one car, sometimes even more, and a car would be 2 people, right? So watching. So you already have 30, 40 people in a small consulate. So imagine big embassies, like, for example, the Swedish embassy in Warsaw, which was penetrated on a regular basis. This was a big institution. So you'd have, dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of people conducting surveillance during the search.
Okay, I see. So since you mentioned that they would be out at 4 or 5 in the morning, were these officers that were inside, were they in for several hours at a time, or was it like get in fast and get out fast?
Yeah, no, it was a few hours. I mean, if you knew the combination, for example, because it had been determined, a week before, for example, and like I said, wasn't changed, then you could be there for a couple hours, for example. It takes a while to go inside, open the safe, even if you know the combination. Do all of this carefully. Do all of this tiptoeing if there were people inside the embassy. And you have to photograph that. Today, with our smartphones and digital cameras or whatever, you could basically take a picture of a document in any light, and some kind of IT specialist would later zoom in, whatever, he would figure it out. But then they had the cameras, right? They had to put it under the right light, right? They had to worry about the focus and things like this. So it took a while. So 2-3 hours was a minimum. But if they had more to do, then it all depended, of course, on when it was safe to go inside. I mean, if the guard, or no, the name, not guard, but one of the residents of the consulate went to sleep usually at 11, then you would not go inside at 11:01. You would go inside at 12 o'clock, and then you had a bunch of stuff to do, so you still stayed until 5, right? So it could take many hours, but it never took a second. Not because they were slow, but simply because you had to be careful. And even when you were pulling out documents from the embassy, from the safe, I'm sorry, you had to pull them out in a way that didn't leave any traces, of you being there. You have to even worry about dust. If you go inside the consulate or embassy, and you see documents that are covered with dust, and it could happen, right? How do you deal with them, right? It is a problem. It sounds funny, but dust is a problem.
Sure. Yeah, understandable. So, were there ever any occasions that you found where they were actually caught in the act, like your officers were found inside of an embassy or consulate?
Never. And if they had been caught, everything, I mean, after that, that would be it, right? I mean, they would never do it again because, if it was a NATO country, they would inform another NATO country that such things were done. It
Hmm.
could be an international scandal. You never know how they would deal with that because, it's just like with, when you catch a spy, some people will report that on the news. Some people will deal with it silently, right? So nobody knows what they would do. Nobody even knows if they would release them, right? I mean, what do you do if you catch a guy inside your embassy? Do you keep him there? Do you kick him out? Do you call the police? And if you call the police, you're calling the Polish police. So what are they going to do? And it's a big problem. So no, they were never caught, because if they had been, it would probably be on the news in New York Times, literally, right?
Hmm.
So no. And the only two things that happened ever were because this Section 9 also had a unit within it that didn't deal with going inside the embassies, but they dealt with opening diplomatic mail in, of course, in a clandestine way. So these guys worked mainly at the Warsaw airport. So obviously the most important diplomatic mail, if you had, one document or something that, was the most important document of the intelligence service of a certain country, that would be brought obviously in somebody's pocket, right? So you would never be able to open that. But normal diplomatic mail, which also includes secrets, sometimes things that are top secret, but everyday mail of an embassy, that came in bags, right? And these bags were sealed, they were locked. Sometimes they were locked with special locks. They were thick bags, thick material. They had, watermarks, this, that. So it was very difficult to open without showing that you were actually there. But still, these bags went through customs just like any other thing. And usually it would work this way, that it would come in on an airplane and there would be a driver, a security guy, whatever from the embassy waiting for it to go through the customs. And the thing that they were looking at, I mean, the security officers from embassies, was time. So basically, they were looking at when the airplane landed and how long it took to actually process their mail. So they would become suspicious after a certain amount of time, obviously, right? So
Hmm.
our officers had to, again, for months and years, they would look at bags and see what locks they had, padlocks. They would look at whatever other safety measures a certain country introduced, and finally, in most cases, they were able to open these things, and they had to do it very quickly. So you asked me about whether these operations were ever discovered by anybody. So there was one case where most probably a politician that was actually the recipient of whatever the Section 9, where I was able to obtain. Obviously, these politicians didn't know where it was coming from. They just knew it was a report from the counterintelligence. It was processed a million times to cover the source, and so on and so on. Nevertheless, a politician in the main party in Poland, he most probably mentioned during a talk with the Germans that something that was inside these documents, a fact, right? And they put two and two together, and it seems that
Mm.
they simply stopped using the method that they were using, and this method was actually a metal case. They didn't use bags, they used a metal case, like a container with a lock and also a counter. It counted how many times you opened the thing. So we were able to figure out a way to open it, and we did it for many years, but then it suddenly disappeared. It was overnight they stopped using it, and it seems that it was probably because somebody said something somewhere where they were not supposed to. This is one thing. And the second thing that happened was a case which actually it happened in the American consulate. It looks like the CIA, the FBI, whoever that was, probably CIA, figured out that there was a leak. Or maybe there was just standard procedure that they would check every consulate in the world, right, from time to time. Nevertheless, what I'm getting at is that the one time when the officers came, they noticed that there was a new piece of furniture, standing right next to the entrance to the vault. It was just a wooden bookcase or something like that, right? And one of the officers, I mean, they were surprised in general. Every time that something new appeared, they were, of course, cautiously approaching it, and so on. And one of the officers heard actually, that there was a very, very, very silent noise every time you approached it. You could hear a click, like a very, very silent click.
Hmm.
And what it turned out to be was a camera that took pictures anytime somebody walked past it, right? It just took a picture every time you approached the vault. So they erased whatever was on the film. You could use light, I guess, right? To it was, back in the day, it wasn't a hard drive, right? So they erased whatever was on this thing, right? They left and they didn't come back until I believe it was like 4 or 5 years later, because there was too big of a risk,
Hmm.
because obviously somebody was, something was happening. But it looks like it wasn't like the Americans found out that it was, our counterintelligence officers entering the vault. Why? You can imagine that in the 1980s, because the 1980s, there were very secure, clandestine ways of surveilling a place. I mean, you could put a 3 millimeter, like a fraction of an inch hole in the ceiling, right? And put a camera there, right? We did such things in the 80s. So obviously, every other intelligence service around the world had such cameras, right? So, as you can imagine, if the Americans knew that we had counterintelligence officers that were able to open a muzzle or vault door without leaving any trace of them being there, they would not put a piece of furniture, a bookcase, next to the door with some, sound, every
Hmm.
time you approach it. So it looks like it was either standard procedure, or if there was a suspicion that one of the workers, one of the, Americans, unfortunately, right, was doing something inside the
Hmm.
vault when he was not supposed to, because obviously they would not use this old school, camera and bookcase, to catch people who were doing such things. If they really had source. I mean, the FBI had, or the CIA had cameras that nobody would ever be able to find, obviously, right? It looks like the Americans knew that there could be a leak, or maybe they were just checking, if there wasn't. Yeah, so we had to stop going inside because we're not sure. And like I said, it was too big of a risk. And after, I believe, 4 or 5 years, I can't remember exactly what year it was, second half of 80s, we slowly started coming back. We used infrared equipment, some other things, radio waves. I mean, equipment checking for radio waves inside the building, to check where there were no electronic devices installed inside the consulate that would, reveal that we were there. And once we determined that there were no devices, the bookcase was gone. Actually, it was in a different place. There are pictures of it in the documents that it was, taken down and put in a different room, and there was no camera inside. We started entering the consulate again.
Hmm. Incredible. So, Tom, earlier you mentioned the use of X-rays, and that was actually extremely significant to this whole story. So, can you talk about how those X-rays were utilized and the cost benefits, the cost versus the benefits of that?
Right. Well, it's not a secret. It's not rocket science that you can x-ray something. You can see what's inside a metal object using radiation, right? So all of the security experts, all of the engineers that build doors, vault doors, and safes, they knew that you could actually x-ray the thing and see, for example, when you have a combination lock and you have wheels inside, 3 or 4, depends on the model, and you, by, what do you call it, I guess it's a dial, yeah, by turning the dial, you rotate these wheels, and if you have the right code, they will be put in a position where another element jumps in and you're able to open the door. It's a long story, and that doesn't need to be said. But basically, you need to see the wheels inside the vault door or the safe to be able to determine what the combination is, right?
Hmm.
So obviously, a burglar could at least try to, drill inside, put a camera inside, and there are, that's what actually safe crackers now do. If you forget your combination, one of many methods, right, of determining the code in your, gun safe, for example, is by drilling a hole and putting a camera inside, like miniature camera, where the expert can see the wheels and he's able to determine the combination. So, you could do that. Even then, you could drill and try to put something inside and see. But obviously, they would never do that, because that way it would be a one-time thing. The next day, when the Americans, British, Germans, whatever came, they would see that somebody was inside their vault, right? So that's out of the question, totally, right? So the only other method of seeing into something without having a hole is obviously radiation. So all the engineers that build vaults and safes, they protected the locks from radiation in one way or another, right? So some of the safes, that's a crude method, but some of the safes would have, for example, a box with lead balls somewhere next to the lock, right? So lead stops radiation. It's very difficult to to see if you try to take a picture with radiation. Other locks, for example, and this includes the locks installed inside your consulates, they would have wheels that were not made of metal, but they were made of plastic. Why plastic? Because obviously plastic is a material through which radiation goes through easily, and therefore on the X-ray film, the actual picture that you have, like when you have your hand broken or whatever, right? You would not be able to see anything because it passed through without any problem, so you wouldn't be able to see anything, right? So yeah, engineers designed different methods of protecting the lock from radiation. It seems that it all started, and I'm saying it seems because I was told that by a case officer that now is in his 90s, actually. And he remembered the first time it was done at the American consulate. At the consulate there, at least at the beginning, right, you had metal wheels inside the lock, right? The plastic ones were later installed in Krakow, the other city. But first in Poznan, you had the metal wheels, right? So Mosler people, the engineers, they inserted a lock with metal wheels, but they had they built a really thick door with thick metal plates and everything. So basically the plates, and actually there are pictures of it in the documents, the plate that was inside the vault on the door, on the inside of the door, said that Mosler certified that it would take 20 hours radiologically obtain the combination, right? So it would take 20 hours to, you would have to expose the door to 20 hours of radiation to be able to see the wheels, right? Clearly in a picture. So yeah, it was not a secret to engineers around the world that you could X-ray something, but they calculated using numbers. I mean, radiation created by isotopes that were, in their opinion, possible to actually use at night at a consulate without killing yourself. Radiation is very, very dangerous, right?
Sure.
So they wondered, okay, so how strong the radiation would be for somebody to actually put it inside a consulate at night, carry it in a box, how strong would it be? And they calculated that the strongest isotope that you could use without suffering later would take 20 hours to X-ray the lock. Unfortunately, and I'm saying unfortunately because a lot of the officers died as a result of this, our officers, the isotopes that they used made it possible to obtain the picture of the wheels at the consulate in Poznan in about 1 hour and a half. So you can imagine how strong it was, right?
Oh my gosh.
So again, your embassies, very well protected. There was a big problem with the Poznan consulate, which was the main first big target when it came to these operations with radiation. The problem was that the engineers or the CIA specialists, whoever that was, who built that vault, they actually thought everything through. So they installed these heavy-ass doors and put the vault inside the building in a position where it would also be difficult to put the isotope anywhere outside on the outer wall, for example, right? So it was all thought over. They put it in the best place possible, obviously because they knew it was possible to X-ray something, right? So because we were not able to put the isotope anywhere outside, and it would have to be, unbelievably strong to do that, right? We thought of a different method. So one of the officers that died some time ago, so yeah, he's not here anymore, he was this very experienced officer of this unit, and he thought of an idea, which was to actually drill a small hole under the vault, under the door of the vault, right? And once he made that hole, he put the isotope, which was either cobalt-60 or iridium-192, but usually cobalt-60. He put it, this isotope was in a small container. It's like a metal capsule, let's say. So he screwed this capsule and this isotope onto a metal rod, a thin piece of metal, right? Onto the, one end of it. And he would push this isotope through this hole that was drilled under the door into the vault, and because the rod was round, finally it would be kind of on the level of your, let's say, waist, right? Mm-hmm. Where the lock was, right? So it would be radiating from the inside of the vault, and then he would put film in front of the lock, and after an hour and a half you'd have a picture of the wheels. So this is how it all started. And later on, it progressed. And, the officers were both looking for safer methods, a little bit safer because it's always dangerous. But, safer methods where you wouldn't have to take tweezers and screw an isotope onto a rod, which is, experts that are listening to us are probably thinking, what in the world is this guy saying? Well, they have to look at the documents because, nobody would do that. I mean, any expert would say, come on, this is suicide. Basically, you're not allowed to do that. I'll give you a good example that is actually in my book. There is a document which presents how much radiation there was around the container used for many years in section 9 for the isotope. So there was and there still is, of course, a norm, like a number that is accepted by, I don't know, it's European regulations, Polish regulations, worldwide regulations, I'm not sure. And it says, for example, that you can have this much radiation around a container, and this is considered safe, and this is considered safe for the workers, and you can work with such a container. You can sell it, and it's, you have a license, right? You got a license if it's safe enough, right? So this document that is in my book shows that at a distance of 50 millimeters, right? So very close to the container, they measured that the norm, right? The legal, norm was exceeded 500 times. So it's 500 times more than what the law accepted for people working with radiation, right? At a power plant or whatever, right? So you can imagine how drastically dangerous this was. And yeah, experts probably think, Jesus Christ, that's just, crazy, because it is extremely dangerous. So with time, the officers did everything they could to improve the conditions. And also they had to tackle some, obstacles that arise along the way. One of them was the wheels that I mentioned, the plastic wheels. You couldn't use this method that I described with plastic wheels because you just wouldn't see anything. You could radiate that, the door for hours and hours and hours, and at the end of the day, you just have blank space where the lock is, right? Because the wheels are plastic. You could see maybe some other elements of the lock, but definitely not what you were most interested in. So what they did was they used, it's called a scintillation probe. This is a device it's a very sophisticated device used for measuring radiation levels. So it's a tube usually, and the radiation goes inside, and there's like a computer usually connected to that shows, or some kind of meter, right, that shows dials and things like that, shows how much radiation there is. So what they did was, because the wheels were plastic, they would come to a safe or a vault that had these plastic wheels. One of these places was the consulate in Krakow. But there were other embassies that bought such locks in the 80s. So, it was a method that they had to use very often. So they would check what lock it is. They would check where, because, okay, let's come back for a second to the wheels that I described, right? They have to, for the lock to open, they have to be in a certain position. So the wheel is not, anybody can Google now combination lock wheels and probably they'll see a picture. So this wheel is not 360 degrees, full metal. There's a notch in one of the places in the wheel. So for the lock to open, all of these notches had to align. And then in this space that was created, right, with the 3 or 4 wheels, right, the notches were in one position. There was an element that jumped in, and then you would open the lock, right? So basically, the officers would check the particular model of a lock. They could potentially even buy one in West Germany, for example, the same one. They would look at it. They would unscrew everything, look at, measure everything, and they would check where on the lock the notch appears when you insert the right combination. So they would come back to the embassy, and they would take collimator. So collimator is that's an easy, you could say, device, not even device, it's a tool, I guess, right? So it's a piece of metal. Of course, okay, maybe it sounds easier than it actually is when I say it, but yeah, it's basically a piece of metal, special metal, right? That is a long tube, with a hole inside. So you shoot, let's say, the beam, the rays, the gamma rays through it, and then you have a collimated beam, right? So a thin beam of radiation, right? That, of course, over time becomes wider and wider, as it is with many objects in physics, right? But at the very beginning, it's collimated, so it's a thin beam, right? So they would shoot the radiation through this collimator exactly in the place where they were hoping for the notches, right, in the wheels to appear, where they should appear, right? And then some meters away, the funny story is with the Swedish embassy, because they actually, every time they did that, they had to wait for the Swedish ambassador who lived inside the embassy. They would have to wait for him to go on holidays. And then they would shoot the beam through the vault door, through the lock. And they would have these before mentioned scintillation probes, these devices to measure radiation, set up in the ambassador's kitchen. So they would be sitting in the kitchen, because the kitchen was behind, I'm not sure if it was, how many feet, 50 feet or something, behind the vault, right? So they would set up all of these devices in his kitchen, and the beam coming from the vault would end up in this very sensitive scintillation probe, which detected radiation. And then this is also a tragic story, but in many cases, the officers would basically stand right next to the isotope, right next to the collimator, and they would be manually with their hand turning the dial on the combination lock by a notch, by half a notch, a little bit. So they would move the notch from, let's say, 1 to 2, right? You have the combination lock and the numbers. So they would move it a little bit. And then the other guys in the ambassador's kitchen would see if anything changed in the results and the radiation, how strong it is. And then if on one of the notches, they saw a small change, right? So they saw that the radiation was a little bit more strong. This would indicate that possibly the notch on one of the wheels, right, is in the way, or actually there's nothing in the way because there's a notch. You understand, right? So they would start off with 4 wheels covering, right? There were no notches. And then as they were turning, a notch would appear on one of the wheels, which allowed for more radiation to go through. So they would write it down and they would turn that, for a long time, check, write down. And at the end of the day, they would have a list of possible combinations, right? Because they would see in what positions there was a visible result, right, on the meter, right? So yeah, they would this way find out what the combination is. But you have to understand that they were turning manual. Not only they were in the room where there was radiation, even if you have a collimator, there's still radiation around it, obviously. But also they were actually turning the dial with their hands. So there are documents in these files saying, for example, that this and this officer got this and this much radiation on his right hand. What does that mean? He was operating something, right, next to the beam with his hand. For example, the dial on the lock. So, these numbers are crazy and they're really high. And like I said, many of these men unfortunately died.
So, Tom, were they fully aware of the danger that they were in at the time? I mean, was any of this kept from them?
No, not at all. First of all, nobody would keep it from them because you need to be fair. And second of all, we're not talking about, some kind of guy that was pulled out of some workshop fixing cars, of course, people who fix cars are also expert, but obviously they don't know about radiation, right? So these were not men that were taken from somewhere without any knowledge of anything. These were people who sometimes had PhDs. So these would be sometimes scientists or engineers, and even if not engineers, then just great experts at what they were doing. And they not only knew, some of them had licenses for working with radiation obtained at different institutions, right? So like I said, they would have PhDs. So not only they were aware, they actually calculated all of this. It's not like somebody gave them a method and said, do it, whatever. You just dial this thing, move it, and not dial, sorry, but move the dial and see what happens. They actually were the men who calculated and designed all of this equipment. So, for example, they would have an idea for equipment. Sometimes it wouldn't be made by them simply because, they were not a factory where you could produce a device, but they would actually design stuff and then go to different factories, institutions around Poland, present themselves to the military, which they were not because it was the Ministry of Internal Affairs. And they would say, we're the military. We would like to do some research on metal objects where you have air inside, but there are some metal elements and we would like to see. So why don't you design this for us? And they would give them a design, an idea for a device. The company would say, okay, we can do that. Why not? We'll help the military. And they did. And they would have, devices that were basically designed partially by them.
Oh my gosh. That is amazing to me. I mean, these are tremendously capable guys, but so they were knowingly trading their futures to accomplish these missions, and they knew what it was doing to their lifespans then overall, right?
Yes, and this is why they, like I said, tried to develop these methods as much as possible. First, because there were some obstacles like the plastic wheels, but also because they were trying to be safer and safer. And there are different devices that appear within this Section 9 in the 80s. So, for example, I mentioned that they had to move the dial manually. So this, for example, was the case at the Swedish embassy because the Swedish embassy had a sophisticated lock on the vault door where you wouldn't just turn the dial, but you also had to press it. So, it was very difficult to create a device that would be able to press it and move it by exactly by a half a notch. You could do it, but it was it would also be standing in the way of radiation. So just different circumstances didn't allow for them to use any device to rotate the dial. But at different embassies, where for example you had a normal combination lock where you just turn left and right, they were able, for example, to design a device that would remotely, with them standing at a distance, turn the dial by half a notch, right? Exactly by half a notch. So, such things started appearing, right? They did what they could do to stay as far away from the, vault and the safe that they were working on. But, that could never be 100% safe, because they had to carry that thing inside. And for them to have a container that would block all the radiation, you can imagine how much it would weigh. So you would not be able to carry that with the residents of the embassy sleeping just 10 inches away from you. You wouldn't be able to carry a like a 2,000-pound container, right? So it had to be mobile enough, right? So they did what they could to have light containers that protected them as much as possible, but they never protected them 100%, because it's physically impossible today, even, I suppose, right? There are no materials that would weigh a container that would weigh 40 pounds and protect you totally from radiation. It's probably impossible. I don't know, but I'm guessing it's impossible.
Yeah, I would imagine so. That's incredible. So what do you think, Tom, was their motivation to do this incredibly dangerous work? Like, were they well compensated, or were they very, patriotic, service first kind of guys, or something else?
It's very interesting. I mean, very good that you asked that, because there is a certain paradox in Section 9, because you asked if they were paid well. These operations were so secret until just recently. My book appeared, and people now know about it. But before that, I was the first one to open these documents too, right? There's, when you open files in such institutions like our archives, there's a list of people that opened it. I was the first one, right? So it's only the surface now. So this thing was so secret, even within the intelligence, the counterintelligence, that people didn't talk about it. Even the bosses of, like the person that was always present actually during these operations, not exactly at the embassy, but usually in an apartment or a car close by, was actually the deputy chief of counterintelligence. That's a very high position. And he would always, it was the same person for this in the 70s and 80s, all throughout these years. It was the same guy that every time, 100 and something times a year sometimes, he would be present at night. It's actually, he was actually like 60 years old or something in the 80s, and he still had to do that. So that's a lot for a 60-year-old guy. But he would go, every other night, or, every 3 days, he would go and spend the night with this Section 9, sitting in a car in an apartment close by. And he was kind of like the guy in charge, right? If something, there was very important decision had to be made, he would make it, right? Of course, his decisions didn't concern, technical aspects, because he had no idea about them. It was just, a high-ranking officer. If, let's say, there was a screw-up and our guys were caught, right, which never happened, but if they were, he would be the guy to react and make a decision. And we're running, we're doing this, we're calling the militia, which is the police then. But the motivation, oh yeah, I know what we were talking about. We were talking about the money, if they were paid. So this guy, the deputy chief of counterintelligence, knew. The chief of counterintelligence obviously knew. But for example, I have a great example. I talked to the chief of our intelligence from the 1970s just a few months ago. He told me, he read my book. I gave it to him. He read it. And he said, well, sir, can you imagine that me being the head of intelligence, right? I had no idea about this until I read your book. I had no idea. I had no clue. Nobody ever told me. I was not informed. And so you can imagine how big of a secret that was. And there is a paradox that this secrecy caused. So the irony is that because nobody knew what they were doing and what they were accomplishing, it was very hard to go through the bureaucracy of the Ministry of Internal Affairs and actually get, for example, the director responsible for money inside the Ministry of Internal Affairs to say, okay, we're going to give them twice more money. There was an idea, I believe it was in the 80s or in the 70s. There are actually a lot of documents concerning that, and the officers told me about it, that there was hope that the head of the counterintelligence, who he knew very well, right, what they were doing, he presented a document, I believe, to the Minister of Internal Affairs saying that the Section 9 deals with very stressful and very unhealthy work. The officers are exposed to a lot of stress and a lot of health issues, right? and therefore we would like for them to retire faster, right? Yeah, so they would get their retirement much faster than the other, let's say, normal officers do. And this idea didn't even go through because the minister read it. He probably gave it to, I don't know, his deputy. The deputy said, what the hell are they doing? He probably called the head of counterintelligence and said, okay, well, possibly we could do that, but, tell me what they do. And what did the head of counterintelligence say? Nothing. He was, he would say, oh, well, yeah, well, they do this stuff that is stressful, but what is it? Well, he wouldn't tell him. So they never got more money. They got bonuses. Sometimes if something, very important was found in the safes and so on. But these were bonuses just like the bonuses that other officers got, just like in any other institution or company. So no, they did not earn more money. And their motivation was very simple. What is the motivation of, FBI officers? What is the motivation of MI6, MI5 officers, whatever? It's just, working for the country. They were discovering things that mattered. They were catching spies. They were detecting different threats, right? So they were just working for the country, and they continued to work later on in the 90s and 2000s, right? Together with the Americans too, right? I don't know what they did because what's post 1990 is secret, but yeah, they did work just like they worked for Poland before 1990. They worked for Poland post 1990.
Amazing. These guys were incredible, rare finds then in that case to do that kind of work with no recognition, no kind of material reward, and knowing explicitly what it was doing to their own health and longevity, and they still went ahead and did the job. That's incredible.
Right.
So, Tom, are you aware of any specific intelligence that they were able to gather, like any of the actual successes that all of this hard work brought them?
You have kind of two types of information, right? One was the information that was strictly interesting to the case officers and counterintelligence, right? So things that related to espionage. So the basic thing that would be found at a major embassy or consulate would for sure be letters or other evidence of walk-ins. And I'm sure some of the listeners know, but let's just say quickly who walk-ins are. And the walk-ins are, of course, the people who voluntarily offer their services, so they want to be a spy for a certain country. So for example, at that time you had a Pole that would come to the British embassy, for example, and either physically come and say, oh, quietly say to the guard, well, can I meet with the guy from the intelligence or something? And then the guard would, call the guy from the intelligence guy would come and possibly either, take him to a room and discuss, matters with him, or maybe he would tell him, leave right away and I'll meet you on this day, or call this number, whatever, right? So that's a walk-in, right? Somebody that offers voluntarily, he's not forced by anybody, it's just his idea. So at all major embassies and consulates, they found evidence of the presence of walk-ins. So either, documents saying on this and this day, a guy, whatever, his name and last name came and, we discussed this and he offered that. So even if an embassy, and it happened, right, didn't have a huge intelligence station, right? There was only one officer, or there was no officer at the time or something, right? Which happened rarely. They usually had somebody. But even if they didn't, there still would be that first document that indicated that somebody came, and that would be given to the intelligence either in the country itself, right? I mean, it would be sent somewhere to Great Britain or whatever, Germany or something, or it would be later given to the chief of station or whatever. But there was something on paper that very often was even in one of the first safe somewhere, because yesterday there was a walk-in and they put in the first safe and they waited for the next day to give it to the chief of station, right? So they put in the safe, they thought it was safe because it's a big ass safe and a nice vault, so they didn't think that anybody would see it. And also, like I said, there were letters too. So walk-ins very often back in the day, and who knows, maybe even today as well, they would just send letters, right, to a particular embassy saying, I can meet you here and there. I'm an officer in the Polish army. Why don't we meet, right, and discuss business? So the officers would find that, for example, and the case officers dealing with a particular country would work on that case. And of course, there are many solutions. You could meet with the guy pretending to be an officer, a British officer, for example. So a Polish officer who speaks English very well would meet with the walk-in and say, oh, yeah, well, I'm from MI6 or whatever, and I'll work with you. And of course, the Pole would say, yeah, sure, I want money, blah, blah, blah. And that evidence would be gathered and the guy would be arrested, for example, right? You could also have other solutions, right? So they would, for example, surveil that guy and watch him meet with the MI6 officer. That's broad counterintelligence and probably a topic for a different discussion, right? But they could, observe them and see how MI6 operates, see what kind of, I don't know, communications plans he gets, right? What kind of devices, one-time pads, whatever. So there are a lot of things you can do knowing that somebody is a spy, right? Mm-hmm. So this is one thing. Then also, of course, there were situations where our counterintelligence was able to particularly get into the safes of the station of an intelligence service, right? Within the embassy. So what was inside, that kind of stuff. I mean, just everything, right? So you had everything that had to do with recruited agents. Sometimes, it was literally said, sometimes you'd have code names, but you'd have a lot of information, right? About, the operations of a particular service. So there were situations like, for example, a big case in the 80s where my interviewees entered the Spanish embassy and they opened an unbelievably advanced safe which actually had a timer inside. A timer is something that now there's not a lot of cash at banks, but back in the day, even 10 years ago, right, you'd have, in Poland there were such safes, so I'm sure around the world too, you'd have the bank teller and behind him there would be a safe with cash, but the safe would say, it was visible to all the people visiting the bank, the safe would say, we're sorry, but our workers cannot open the safe between the 7 o'clock in the morning and 9 o'clock in the evening. So don't even bother trying to rob them because there's a timer inside. So the timer is a device back in the day, and maybe even today, it's a mechanical device. It's just a clock, right? That you set, and you cannot open the safe, for example, at night or during the day, whatever you set it to, right? So this safe had a timer, a sophisticated timer inside with 3 clocks. There are pictures of it actually in the book. So the Spanish people, when they were leaving the embassy, they would, set the clock to, 12 hours or whatever, whenever they came back to the embassy, right? So it was impossible even for them to open the safe, their own safe, at night, right? Because it was just blocked. But our officers worked on it, and it's one of the most fascinating stories actually that, we discussed, and they said, well, even though it's not a secret anymore, because maybe somewhere, I didn't find it in the documents, but there are a lot, so maybe it is somewhere there. I haven't found it yet, but we discussed, and they said, even though it's declassified, let's just not tell people how we did it. Maybe keep it a secret. But it's an amazing story how they beat that clock, and there are pictures of it in the book. So they opened the safe, and inside the safe, they found an entire archive of the Spanish intelligence service. So these were floppy disks that were actually encrypted, but they copied the floppy disks, they encrypted it. Our counterintelligence computer experts, because, we're talking about the 80s. This is not Middle Ages. We're talking about computers and floppy disks as well. So they decrypted it, and we were able to, this way we obtained the entire list, the entire archive of agents ran by the Spanish intelligence in Poland. So this is just one of the examples. The Americans kept their intelligence documents, some of them, not all of them, because obviously the station, the Polish CIA station, was in Warsaw at the embassy. Rightly so, because it was very well protected. But there were CIA documents in Poznan and in Krakow as well, right? So there's a list, for example, in the book, which mentions secret CIA documents that were obtained. I can't remember if it was Poznan or Krakow. So there's a list saying, secret document of the CIA, for example, concerning the plans for intelligence gathering for the next month. So, if you have a document saying, okay, the director or deputy or whatever of the CIA would like to find out more about the factory of tanks in the southern part of Poland, right? And it's exactly mentioned. You can do things to either catch whoever will be spying there, within a month, 2, 3, 4, whatever, or you can, set up, different counterintelligence, double agent operations. You can do a lot of things. This is very valuable knowledge.
Sure.
And then the second part, which I think doesn't require such a long explanation, is all of the documents dealing with true embassy work. So we would know exactly what the plans of a particular country were for us. We knew exactly what, for example, that's another good example. We would have copies of discussions that, for example, the representatives of different NATO countries had about a certain event that would take place in Poland, right? I don't know, the elections. So we knew exactly what they were thinking. We knew what their plans were. We would be able to anticipate stuff. And yeah, just extremely valuable stuff.
My gosh, yeah, that's absolute treasure trove every time. I'm imagining these guys, since you were talking about the walk-ins right at the beginning, thinking
Mhm.
about these people that are taking what they know is the biggest risk of their life by walking into this foreign embassy and offering their services. And whether it's because they want to get out, or whether ideological reasons, or just for a big payout. And they're being assured that their information will never be revealed to anyone, their personal information. And neither of the people having that conversation know that that safe is going to be open that night
Right, right,
by somebody who's
right,
been in there 20 times before and is going to keep doing it every week. So that's a
right. But
pretty
quite
horrifying thing to consider, even though of course they know that there always is some risk to walking in.
Yeah, and especially sending a letter. I mean, of
Oh
course,
yeah.
now we can pretend to be smart because we have all this knowledge. But even back in the day, it seems so risky to me to send a letter. I mean, even an amateur should figure out that all of the mail, not just in Poland, but just anywhere around the world, and letters sent to the Russian embassy in Washington could be surveilled. I mean, could be opened, right, by
Mhm.
somebody. It's not difficult to intercept at the post office, where you'd have a source, and he would just put aside every letter that said, Russian embassy, Soviet embassy, actually, at the time,
Mhm.
right? It's really risky, and I think it was a bad decision on their part to actually send letters. But yeah, that's what happened, and we were able to find evidence of that.
Yeah. Amazing stuff. Amazing stuff. So you've mentioned 1990 several times as a vast change, and of course it was for so many reasons. But what happened exactly to Section 9 once the government completely transitioned?
I believe I mentioned earlier that I just can't ask, because everything that's post
Yeah.
99, I would like to know. It would be cool, but at the same time, I will never ask, because you have to respect the fact that it's secret. It's even illegal for me to know. So I don't know what happened post 1990. I can say what generally happened to the intelligence counterintelligence service. So once 1990 kicks in, right, the former, it's called SB, the security service, yeah, of Poland, is shut down, right? It closes its doors and is transformed into something called UOP, Urząd Ochrony Państwa, which is Office of State Protection. This institution, inside it has intelligence, counterintelligence. Years later, now today, we have counterintelligence, intelligence separately, but then it was one institution, right, that the former security service turned into. Yeah, so now we have this new institution, and practically all of the officers from the counterintelligence, for sure from Section 9, just go on to work in the new structure. And so is the case for most of the other counterintelligence officers, case officers, intelligence officers, right? They just start working in the new reality alongside some new people, right? That were, hired. So yeah, they keep on working. And yeah, and they have new targets, obviously, right? So Russia becomes a target overnight, you could say, right? You know what happened in Europe, right?
Yeah.
So it's the
Yeah.
fall of communism, and you have new targets when the main one is basically Russia. So I don't know what they did, but it's obvious that they didn't suddenly in 1990 start sitting behind a desk, playing a computer game, right?
Right.
They
Right.
had to do something technical. I think it would be important and nice to mention what the head, actually, the former head of our Office of State Protection, so the new institution that I mentioned from the 1990s, he wasn't one of the people that I interviewed, because he was one of the people that he was a case officer that took part in these clandestine searches with Section 9, right? So he knew them very well. He was friends with them. And he was, like I said, after 1990, he was the head of the entire intelligence, counterintelligence combined. And his part of my interview with him is the very end of my book, and it won't be too big of a spoiler if I say what he said. And he said, well, I can't say what these men did after 1990, because now it's still taboo. But I can say one thing, that they were one of the most important people that we showed the Americans, to present ourselves and to show what we can do, and that we are worth of American, or worth of being allies with the Americans, that
Hmm.
we're worth something. So these are one of the most important men that we showed the Americans after 1990. And he also said, yeah, it's taboo. He can't say what they did, but he assured me, that's the very end of my book, that once these documents are declassified, God knows when, in 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, God knows if I'll be alive, he said that I will for sure have a nice book out of that.
Oh
That
man,
he
looking
can
forward to
tell me what
volume
they
two.
did. They went on to work for the new counterintelligence. They went on to work with our new allies, such as the Americans. What they did, I don't know. But let me just say one thing: that what we describe today is not something that was only done by the Poles. It seems that the radiation method was only used by us and the Soviets. It doesn't look like even the other Warsaw Pact counterintelligence services knew about it. So there is some
Hmm.
evidence that proves that. We don't know for sure, but it seems that the Russians only shared that method in the early 70s, probably, and maybe late 60s with us. But it doesn't seem like the Hungarians, for example, knew it, because the Hungarians, our Section 9 officers met the Hungarians. The different intelligence services and counterintelligence services, I'm sorry, they cooperated just like they do within NATO today. So they had a chance to meet the technical counterintelligence people, Hungary, and there was no mention of radiation. They had no idea, so they didn't look like they knew anything about that, unless they were just not talking about it. But they could, we were allies, and these were men that did the same thing, so they could talk about it. So they knew they would probably mention it. So it seems that we could have been the only ones together with the Soviets. So, but at the same time, we were, all of the things we discussed today, I mean, the clandestine searches themselves, these are not things that were only done by us. This is something that was done by most respected counterintelligence services around the world. There's been mention, and you can find it online, probably, old news reports, or even in new books you can find some information about some NATO country, right, conducting a clandestine search. I remember one time I read, it didn't concern the FBI, so it didn't concern American territory, but I read something about CIA teams doing that in embassies around the world, right? So this is something that is done, was done, and most probably is done today as well. So what I'm getting at is that I don't know what they did post 1990, but why wouldn't they keep on doing what they did against new targets? I mean, I
Right.
don't see any reason why they would not do it. Maybe the new government would be a little bit concerned with the radiation thing, right? So they would say, well, maybe there's something else you can do. But then on the other hand, the new government would never even know about the radiation because they were never told. This was a secret of these men and the boss of counterintelligence, some of his deputies maybe. And the Polish president didn't know about the radiation. He possibly maybe not didn't even know exactly that the vaults were entered, right? He would know that there was some information obtained by the counterintelligence. I'm sure a lot of our listeners read somewhere what such reports made by intelligence, counterintelligence look like. So such a document usually says that the intelligence service has obtained information pointing to blah blah blah. Yeah, so the president doesn't, if he's professional, he doesn't even ask. He doesn't say, oh, tell me the name of the agent or whatever source you have that gave you this information. He does not ask if he's professional, right? So I don't see a reason why post 1990 they wouldn't continue to do these clandestine searches. I don't know what about the radiation, but also who knows? They might have continued to do the exactly same thing
Hmm.
alongside their new allies, including the Americans. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah, I look forward to that story one day, although I think we'll be waiting a very long time, I would
Yeah,
imagine.
I think so. This time, I hope I would like to know what they did, but at the same time, I hope they will not declassify documents in the near future because, yeah, that's not just not the way it should be done. Counterintelligence is an important intelligence. Counterintelligence is an important thing, and these documents should be kept secret for many, many years.
Yeah, of course. Of course, there needs to be a sound judgment utilized when you release documents, certainly because of the people it might endanger. I have to say, Tom, it's amazing to me that not only would they transition during that period of around 1990 to from targeting NATO to working closely with NATO, who is now their allies, but the new number one target, Russia, already knows all their tricks because they introduced so many of those tricks
Yeah,
in
yeah,
years past. So what a
that's enough.
challenging target that is.
Mm-hmm. It is. It is. Speaking of the times after 1990, there's one more thing I would like to mention, and I think it's an important part of the story, is that I think it will be even hard to understand for some of our listeners because yeah, it's just a crazy story, and people will probably scratch their heads and say, well, how is that even possible? Well, some years ago, not so long ago, actually, a few years ago, well, a little bit more, sorry, but in present times, the Polish government, pressured by different politicians, pressured sometimes by people outside the government, they decided to take away the pensions of all the officers of our intelligence, counterintelligence, even if, and this is amazing, even if they worked one day, as little as one day in Polish People's Republic, so before the fall of communism. So if somebody, and that's not a joke, there were such cases, they're described in the media and so on. If somebody was a secretary, I'm not kidding, somebody was a secretary, somebody that dealt with the library, just like a librarian at the Ministry of Internal Affairs, and started working a day, 2 days, 3 days before the fall of communism, and then went on to work 30 years in the counterintelligence, she would have her pension cut by, she would have like 5 times less, 4 times less. Only the minimum to survive, actually even less than minimum with the inflation and everything. It's just ridiculous amounts of money. It's very little. So they would have all their pensions taken away if they even worked one day. So this is one of the most ridiculous things that I've ever heard of. These people in 1990, when they were hired by the new counterintelligence service, they were given a job and they were shown that, that the new government had trust. They went on to work and create great relationships with, well, mainly Americans. Again, we come back to the same thing. You were and you are our main ally. Mm-hmm. And we work very closely. And so these officers that worked before the fall of communism were the ones responsible for creating great relationships that last until this day. These people, these men became privately, outside of counterintelligence, they became friends with CIA officers, FBI officers, just friends, privately friends. And then suddenly, many years later, the government decided to take their pensions away because they worked for a day, for 10 years, for 15 years, for 2 months, before 1990, for years and years. And this story is fortunately coming to a good end now because more and more officers are winning their money back in the courts. So they're getting their money back. But for many years, there were situations where they seriously didn't have enough money to survive. Most of them had kids, like most people do around the world, right? And it was the kids that had to basically pay for everything because these people didn't have any pension, only very minimum amounts of money. Yeah, so I've heard many comments from CIA officers who also were shocked. They were saying like, why the hell are you doing this? We worked with these men. They got medals from us. I mean, come on, our counterintelligence officers got medals from your presidents post 1990, and then suddenly they're punished for working before 1990, even though in 1990 they were told that the new government trusted them. They deserved the trust. Like I said, accomplished a lot for our secret services. So luckily this story is coming to a positive end now, slowly. But there are officers who died of heart attacks within the process. During the process of trying to get the money back. So they would get, for example, 1-2 negative decision from the court. And I'm not joking, there's a list of such people actually created. They would die the same day, the next day. Because imagine working all your life, sometimes 40 plus years in the counterintelligence. And then you retire, you deserve to retire, right? And you deserve to, live out your years, your summer house or whatever. And suddenly you're left with nothing.
Yeah, that's unthinkable for so many people. My gosh.
Right.
Wow. Okay. Well, yeah, I'll have to look into that a little bit. I hadn't heard that story before, but that is really unfortunate that you do exactly what's expected of you for so long, and then 30 years later you get the rug pulled out from under you, like you said.
Exactly. Unthinkable.
Amazing. Yeah. So, Tom, this has been incredible. I am very, very happy you were able to research this story and share it with all of us. What are you working on now that your book has been published?
Basically, my goal is to raise counterintelligence awareness. And we live in times when, we're talking about the Cold War and we think of spies, we think of the Cold War, but we have just as many, and some people say more, spies right now. And I think counterintelligence awareness is something that makes a big difference.
Yeah, I agree. I think you're certainly doing that now because so many people are going to hear this story and be as amazed by it as I have been. And do you have any public-facing website or social media or anything like that if people want to connect with you after this?
Well, if somebody wants to connect with me, I have my email address is appropriate for somebody who wants to raise counterintelligence awareness. So you can email me at howtocatchaspy@protonmail.com.
Oh,
so
wow. Okay.
That's how to catch a spy, no dots, and then at protonmail.com.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, we'll share that in the show notes if you don't mind.
Great. Yeah. Sure.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Tom. This has been incredibly enlightening, honestly, and I really appreciate you sharing this story with us.
Thanks for having me. That was great.
Absolutely. Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there is lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.